This is a video to help prepare you for our first Unit 1 Nature of Science and Engineering ISN check. Please make sure you look through the video with your ISN in front of you so you can follow along. Please make sure there is a cover on your notebook, complete with your first and last name and also your period. We want to make sure the cover is easy to read so people know whose notebook it is. The ISN check will start at the Unit 1 Table of Contents on page 7. We have completed the table of contents in class, and you should have all the way from page 8 to 37 filled in the table of contents. If you're missing some items, check on Science 6 page on the bulletin board and scroll down to the icon that says ISN Table of Contents. There you will find the digital copy of this. On page 8 is the Unit 1 Nature of Science and Engineering vocabulary sheet. On page 9, we have the handout hinge taped called Saving Fred the Solution. And on page 10, the minions loose in the lab. On page 11 is the No I in Teamwork, where we worked on team building in science, and across from that on page 12, the scientific method. On page 13 is the qualitative quantitative lab, and also a warm-up from the 14th. On page 14 is Observations and Science Notes, what is qualitative and quantitative data. On page 15 is the Mythbusters handout where you identified the steps of the scientific method, and on page 16 was the penny experiment. On page 17 we have a warm-up from September 16th, and also we've hinge taped on top our helicopter drop time graph. Across from that on page 18 was our experimental design with the paper helicopter. On page 19 we had two warm-ups, one about engineers, another one listing of what you think an engineer does. On page 20 was the Roll a Challenge, where you wrote down what your dice asked you to roll and then you sketched and labeled your engineered design. On page 21 we drew a sketch of your revised design and final design and went through the steps of the design process. Across on page 22 is the engineering design process, the steps that engineers use to solve problems. On page 23 is the T-chart we made about learning about engineering, and under that T-chart was the warm-up from September 25th, identifying variables. On page 24 was the testable hypothesis, control, and variable activity. On page 25 was the SpongeBob controls and variables, where we identified the controls and variables in SpongeBob SquarePants' many experiments. On page 26 was the metric system notes. And on page 27 was the metric media conversion practice, with on page 28 the metric media scavenger hunt. These boxes might not all be filled in, depends how many cards you were able to find. On page 29 was a warm-up from September 30th about conversions and metric units. And on page 30 was our metric stations lab, where we went around to the 9 stations on the front and the back and practiced measuring in the metric. On page 31 was our bar graph and line graph practice using Sultan, and also both Sultan warm-ups from the October 1st and October 2nd warm-ups. Across on that on page 32 was the Sultan notes that we completed in class. 33 will be a blank page at this time. We will be filling that in later. And on page 34 was the Sultan practice with the 2 bar graphs and the 2 line graphs on the back that we went over in class. And then on page 35 was our class average data from the M&M lab. And on 36 was the lab M&M temperature and color, where we went through the steps of the scientific method, practicing measuring and graphing in the metric. And on page 37 should be your completed study guide. If you find you're missing any of these items, please make sure to check School Loop for the attachments on the calendar and also see the link to the table of contents and warm-ups. It's been a fun unit.